Thomas the Tank Engine. Now, what is this Thomas the Tank Engine? Well, let me tell you. It is a show based on a book series that was written by the train enthusiast, the great Reverend Wilbert Awdry. The stories in the show are about a little tank engine called Thomas and his friends who live on the magical island of Sodor. The railway that Thomas works on is run by the very gentlemanlike Sir Topham Hatt, also known as the Fat Controller. The railway is worked by Thomas and his friends, and allow me to introduce some of them. Thomas the Tank Engine is the number one engine. He is a small little tank engine with 6 small wheels, a short stumpy funnel, a short stumpy boiler, and a short stumpy dome. He's a cheeky little engine that serves as the main character of the series, and he's consistently getting into mischief and consistently has to be taught a lesson. Percy is the number 6 engine. He's also a small tank engine with 4 wheels, and he is Thomas's best friend. He is fairly naive at times, has a lot to learn, and is also called the Green Caterpillar. James, the number 5 engine, he is a small mixed traffic engine with a bright red livery. He is very proud of his red paint, and this kind of makes him a little vain throughout the series. He's also got a little bit of a Napoleonic complex. He kind of wants to be respected as much as the bigger engines, but it's not always given to him. Henry is the number 3 engine. He is a large, tender engine. He's very prideful, but he's also fairly insecure. This stems from the fact that he was a poor steamer in the earlier episodes. Despite his prideful and insecurity, he is a big old softy. He's definitely got a big soft spot for nature. Gordon, the number 4 engine, he is also a large, tender engine. He is known for pulling the express. He is very proud and very arrogant, but at the same time, he also has his mature moments. Edward, the number 2 engine, he's a very small, tender engine. He's old and wise, but he's often mocked by his size and age, especially by the bigger engines. But despite this, he always shows his worth and always shows that he's a very useful engine. Toby, the number 7 tram engine. He is old and wise, and it is witty. Nothing gets past him. I absolutely love him. Last but not least, Duck. He is the number 8 engine. He is a tank engine just like Thomas and Percy. He is proud of being Great Western and will never let you forget that he is Great Western. And he is known to stand up for the little guy. Now, as previously mentioned, Thomas is based off of a book series. This book series is known as the Railway Series, written by the Reverend Wilbert Awdry. It was first published in 1945. There are 42 books in total. 26 of them were written by Awdry himself, and 16 were written by his son, Christopher. The stories began back in 1942 when Christopher was sick with measles. So Thomas goes way back, during the Second World War, which is really wild to think about. The first book that was published was not actually about Thomas, but was about Henry, Edward, and Gordon, and was titled The 3 Railway Engines. In this book, there are 4 stories in total, titled Edward's Day Out, Edward and Gordon, The Sad Story of Henry, and Edward, Gordon, and Henry. Thomas did not get his first book until 1946 and was heavily requested by Awdry's son, Christopher. And there are also 4 stories in this book titled Thomas and Gordon, Thomas's Train, Thomas and the Trucks, Thomas and the Breakdown Train. The books have amazing illustrations depicting Thomas and his friends. And here is just kind of a list of a couple of illustrators that have been featured for Thomas in the Railway series. William Middleton. He is the first illustrator for the Railway series. He illustrated the 3 engines. However, his style did not really satisfy Awdry's vision and was replaced by Reginald Payne, who was seen as more realistic than Middleton and was able to illustrate a couple of books, but did not return for James the Red Engine due to a nervous breakdown that he had. His replacement was Reginald Dalby. Now, Dalby is seen as the illustrator of the Railway series. His art style was very popular and is currently still popular with the general audience, but Awdry did not care for his illustrations at all due to the lack of accuracy. He redid a lot of the art for the previous books, but unfortunately Dalby resigned after Percy the Green Engine due to Awdry being very angry at him for not using his Percy model as a reference. We're going to fast forward a little bit to Gunvor and Peter Edwards. Gunvor had started out illustrating for the Railway series, but she felt a little unfit for it. So her husband, Peter, took over. And their style was realistic, but it was also very impressionistic as well. They lasted until Audrey's last book, The Tramway Engines. Last but not least, we have Clive Sponge, who illustrated the books when Christopher Audrey took over the Railway series. And his art style is very similar to Dalby's. Now, as previously mentioned, the show is based off of the books by Wilbur Awdry and was developed by Britt Allcroft, a British filmmaker. It ran for 24 seasons and aired from October 9th, 1984 to January 20th, 2021. It was originally aired on the BBC, but it was eventually picked up in the US and was aired on PBS under the name Shining Time Station in 1989. This, however, is not the first time Thomas was aired on television. Back in 1953, Awdry and his publishers were approached by the BBC wanting to make a live show using model trains. Awdry and his publishers had agreed to do the show, and on June 14th, 1953, they aired the episode The Sad Story of Henry. The episode was a complete disaster, to say the least. Most famously, it had a scene where a train had derailed live on television, and somebody had to go and put the train back on the tracks. Awdry was very upset over the blunder and had cancelled any and all future productions with the BBC. Skip forward to about 1979. While producing the documentary on the Bluebell Railway, Britt Allcroft was doing some research for that film. She had read the Railway series and had really fallen in love with the stories that Awdry had written and really wanted to make them into a TV series. She worked tirelessly to convince Awdry to turn his books into a show, and she was finally able to convince him. His publishers were able to sell the rights to the Railway series for about £50,000. Allcroft still needed to raise a lot more money, though, in order to produce the episodes, so she took a second mortgage on her home. She was able to secure finances and began to assemble the film crew. She hired producer and director Dave Mitton, Robert Cardona, and songwriters like Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell. She was even able to bring in the former Beatle Ringo Starr. The series was filmed using train models, which were controlled by radio control, and they were filmed in the Clearwater studio, but were later relocated to Shepperton Studios. As with any new TV show, a pilot had to be made, so they had recorded a pilot episode using plastic models, but these plastic models were very unreliable and very difficult to work with. The pilot was a recreation of Down the Mine, and this pilot has never been seen publicly. A couple of scenes do still exist as they were recycled for when they refilmed Down the Mine using the brass models, and it's very interesting lost media. The episodes of the earlier seasons were retellings of Awdry's books, as that what was in the contract, but around season 3, they started writing their original stories, which were not liked by Awdry. One of these episodes were Henry's Forest, which is an adaptation of a story from a magazine. Awdry famously hated this episode, citing that it was unrealistic and that a train would never just stop suddenly on the tracks without the driver notifying the signalman. He also stated that the trees were way too close to the tracks, and that would not happen in a real railway. Despite the tensions in the background, Thomas the Tank Engine was a major success, not only in the UK, but even in the US and as far as Japan. Japan even has their own dedicated railway for Thomas and his friends called the Oigawa Railway, and there are a lot of Days Out with Thomas events that happen around the US. Thomas the Tank Engine also had its fair share of famous narrators. As previously stated, they had the former Beatle Ringo Starr, who was then replaced by George Carlin, then a very famous American comedian, which is really funny to think because his comedy is definitely not safe for kids. We have Michael Anglis, excuse me if I mispronounced that, who was a very well-known British actor at the time, and even Pierce Brosnan, which was one of the actors for James Bond. Thomas's success was not limited to the TV, but even hit the big screen. In 2000, the movie Thomas and the Magic Railroad was made. The movie included Awdry and Allcroft characters, as well as callbacks to the show Shining Time Station. Big names such as Alec Baldwin and Mara Wilson were brought in to star in the movie. Allcroft even voiced in it and was a voice for Lady. The movie currently has a 42% audience rating on Rotten Tomatoes and a 4 out of 10 on IMDb. It is not a great movie, but it is definitely worth a watch. It's very visually pleasing. Just like any children's show, Thomas teaches children moral lessons through storytelling, but it doesn't do it the way that you might think. The show doesn't talk down to kids, but instead lets the children figure out the lessons with their parents. It promotes cognitive growth by making children think and ask questions. The themes and the morals that are also brought up are very interesting and often not touched by other children's programmings. For example, the idea of responsibility, right? There are several episodes that touch on responsibility. One of the examples is Percy's promise. This episode revolves around Percy promising Thomas that he would take his passengers back home after a day at the beach. On his journey to the station, he has to travel through a storm which blinds him at some points, and he is even submerged in water as some of the tracks have been flooded. Despite these hardships, he presses on and keeps his promise, kind of showing that, a part of being responsible is keeping your word. Another example is the episode Rock and Roll, where Duncan, one of the narrow gauge engines, derails and needs help from Rusty the Little Diesel, who he had insulted earlier. Rusty refuses to help him, but Skarloey, another narrow gauge engine, reminds Rusty to think about the passengers and not to let them down, as it is their responsibility to make sure that they get home safely. Rusty then changes their tune and agrees to help Duncan and the passengers. The show also touched on the idea of death several times, which is pretty rare in children's programming. In Saved from Scrap, Edward saves a little traction engine named Trevor from scrap. Edward does his best to save his life and eventually persuades the vicar to purchase and restore him, thus saving him from being melted down. Another example is Escape, which sort of serves as a continuation of Saved from Scrap. In this episode, Edward tells Douglas about how he's had saved Trevor from scrap and how the Fat Controller also needs another engine on his railway. Later in the episode, Douglas travels to a station on the farthest part of the island where the Diesels work. He finds Oliver and his brake van Toad, who have scrap written all over them. Douglas, inspired by Edward's story, saves Oliver from scrap, and he is restored and eventually adopted into the Fat Controller's railway. One last theme that I kind of want to touch on is just the idea of being really useful, no matter what your age is. Which is really interesting to think that a children's show would touch upon ageism. Take, for example, Edward's exploit. Edward is made fun of by the bigger engines due to his age. Duck, the Great Western Engine, and Boko, the Diesel, defend Edward as they still believe that he is really useful. Later in the episode, Edward is tasked with bringing some passengers back to the big station. On the way back, one of his crank pins break, which causes him to essentially not run as well as he should. Despite this, Edward is determined to take his passengers back and to prove that he is still really useful. Another example is Four Little Engines. In this episode, Skarloey, the narrow gauge engine, is taken out of a shed and is tasked to pull a train. Now, Skarloey is an old engine and is seen as past his prime, yet Skarloey, despite this, still feels that he can do the job. Along the way back from the trip, one of his springs break, causing him to be kind of lopsided. His driver says that maybe they should call in a bus to pick up the passengers. Skarloey says no, and insists that he can finish the journey. And sure enough, the little engine is able to take his passengers back to the station. There are a lot of more themes that Thomas touches on, but if I were to touch on every little theme, this video would be freaking hours long, and it deserves its own video, to be honest. Thomas the Tank Engine is a phenomenal show in my opinion. It is magical not only narratively but also visually. It's very interesting to see that they use trains, toy trains, to create this world. As a child, I really fell for the magic and did not think that these were toys. I thought these were real beings. I thought, this was filmed on site. Not to mention that I really enjoyed the stories and I never felt bored, right? I never felt that the lessons or the episodes were being spoon-fed to me like Barney or Teletubbies, which is really big looking back on it now. Thomas is such an integral part of a lot of people's childhoods and even in culture. I mean, there are references to Thomas from Robot Chicken to Mad TV and even in The Cleveland Show. And the stories of the Reverend will live on and will continue to teach kids about being really, really useful.